Naomi Carter had learned that silence in the Min household was not empty. It was measured, deliberate, the kind of quiet that came from money old enough to stop announcing itself. She moved through the East Wing with a tray balanced against her forearm, her uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, and she did not look at the portraits that lined the hallway because she had learned in her first week that the Min family did not like to be looked at, not even in painted form. She had taken the job 4 months ago, back when her savings had thinned to nothing and her violin, everything from that other life, sat wrapped in cloth in the back of a closet in a rented room in Los Angeles. Juilliard had wanted her once. A stage in Vienna had wanted her once. Then her mother's illness had eaten the money meant for tuition, and after the funeral there had been nothing left to want anything with. So she answered an ad for domestic staff at a private estate in the hills above the city, an estate owned by a man named Min Jae-ho, and she told herself it was temporary the way people tell themselves a lot of things that stop being true. The mansion had a rhythm she learned within her first 2 weeks the way she once learned fingerings, by repetition until her body stopped needing to think about it. Mornings began at 5, before the light fully committed to the sky, with the kitchen staff moving through their tasks in a hush that felt almost reverent. Grace ran the house with a clipboard and a memory sharp enough to catch a misplaced napkin from across a room. Naomi's duties rotated between the East Wing bedrooms, the laundry, and on days when guests were expected, the silver, which she polished with a patience that surprised even her, given how little she had once cared about shine for its own sake. There was something honest in the work, something that asked nothing of her except attention, and after a year of grief that had asked everything of her and given nothing back, honest work with clear edges felt almost like relief. She kept mostly to herself. Grace had warned her, gently, in her first week, that the other staff would test her, the way new hires always got tested, with small unkindnesses disguised as jokes, and Naomi had braced for it without quite knowing what shape it would take. It never came the way she expected. Instead, the staff mostly ignored her, absorbed in their own routines, except for a groundskeeper named Marcus, an older black man who had worked the estate for 6 years and who took to leaving a cup of coffee on the back porch railing for her most mornings without ever mentioning it directly. She never asked him why. She suspected he understood something about being one of very few black faces in a house like this, without either of them needing to say it aloud. Jae-ho was not what she expected the first time she saw him. She expected loud men in loud suits, the kind who filled a room with their voices before they filled it with their bodies. Instead, he stood in the doorway of his study the morning she started, a man of maybe 34 with black hair cut close at the sides, a charcoal suit that fit him the way a second skin fits, and eyes that did not move quickly. He looked at her once, said nothing, and went back to whatever he had been reading. That was the whole of their first encounter. She had been almost insulted by how little he seemed to notice her. Over the following weeks, she came to understand that his silence was not indifference but a kind of economy. He rationed his attention the way other men ration money, spending it only where it earned something back. He never raised his voice at staff, never made demands that weren't already reasonable, and on the rare occasions their paths crossed in a hallway or a stairwell, he would incline his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than a greeting, and continue on. Naomi found herself, against her better judgment, paying more attention to those small inclinations than she should have. The staff talked, of course. In the kitchen, over folded linens, they traded pieces of him like currency. He ran shipping companies that were fronts, they said, for something with sharper edges. Men came to see him late at night and left before sunrise. There was a room on the second floor no one but Jae-ho and a man named Sung-min ever entered. Naomi listened to all of it the way she listened to most gossip, with interest but without appetite, because whatever Jae-ho actually was, he had never once raised his voice at her, never once made her feel smaller than the room she stood in, and that alone put him ahead of half the employers she'd had in her life before this one. The one place in the house she was not permitted to enter was the music room. She discovered this on her second week, when she'd wandered down the wrong corridor with an armful of curtains meant for the guest suite and found herself outside 2 carved doors that looked older than the rest of the house, older than anything else in a mansion built to look expensive rather than aged. She had put her hand on the door out of nothing more than curiosity, and a voice behind her, flat and certain, said, Not that room. She turned. Jae-ho stood at the end of the hall with his hands in his pockets, watching her the way he watched most things, like he was deciding whether something was worth the energy of a reaction. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "Now you do." He didn't move closer. "No one goes in there." "Is it locked?" Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "It doesn't need to be." She hadn't asked again after that. But she thought about it more than she should have, the way a person thinks about a bruise they're not supposed to touch. There was a piano in that house, a Steinway in the main hall that nobody played, gathering dust under a cloth cover like a body waiting for a service, and there was whatever lived behind those carved doors, and she assumed the two were connected in some way that was none of her business. The staff called Jae-ho's mother a subject to avoid. Grace, the head housekeeper, a stout Filipino woman who had worked for the Min family for 11 years and considered herself something like the mansion's memory, told Naomi once, over tea in the pantry, that Jae-ho's mother had died when he was 19 and that the house had been a different kind of quiet before that. "She used to play," Grace said. "Violin. Beautiful the way she played. After she passed, he had that room built around her instrument, like a shrine, and never let another soul near it." Grace had shaken her head slowly. 10 years now. He still won't touch it. What happened to her? Naomi had asked. Grace had hesitated, the way people hesitate when a subject sits close to something dangerous. "Illness," she said finally. "Fast." He wasn't ready. "I don't think a person ever is, but he especially wasn't." She'd looked at Naomi a moment longer than the sentence required. "You lost your mother too, didn't you?" "I could tell. It's in how careful you are with things." Naomi hadn't answered directly. She'd only nodded, and Grace had let the subject drop with the tact of someone who understood that grief did not need to be discussed to be recognized. Naomi filed the rest of the information away, without much thought at the time. It was not her business, and she had learned that in houses like this, curiosity was a luxury the help could not afford. The weeks passed. Autumn thinned into the kind of California winter that never quite committed to cold, and Naomi settled into the estate's routines with the particular numbness of someone who has decided, consciously or not, to stop reaching for the parts of her life that used to matter. She did not open the closet where her violin waited. She told herself there would be time later, once things were stable, once the ache of watching other people's dreams from the outside of a service uniform stopped feeling quite so specific. Later never quite arrived, but she stopped noticing its absence, which she supposed was its own kind of survival. The invitation had come from Sung Min, Jae-ho's right hand, a compact man with a permanently unreadable expression, who informed the staff that they would all be expected at the anniversary gathering that Saturday, marking 10 years since Jae-ho had taken full control of the organization from his uncle. Half the guest list, according to whispers moving through the kitchen, would be men who wanted to see if the quiet boss had gotten soft in a decade of running things. By 6 in the evening, Naomi stood near the edge of the ballroom in her uniform, a glass of water on her tray, watching men in dark suits move through the room like pieces on a board neither of them controlled. Jae-ho held court near the center of it all, and for the first time since she'd started working there, Naomi understood what the staff meant when they called him dangerous. It wasn't in anything he did. It was in the way the room bent slightly toward him without him asking it to. It was near 9, when the champagne had loosened the room's collective posture, that a man Naomi didn't recognize, older, silver at the temples, a rival from another territory whose name she caught only as Director Beck, raised his glass and said something that made the room go still in a different way than before. "I heard," Beck said, loud enough to carry, "that you keep your mother's violin locked away like a coffin. Some men mourn, others hide." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Jae-ho did not raise his voice. "Careful," he said, and the single word landed harder than a shout would have. Beck smiled, unbothered. "I only wonder if the great Min Jae-ho has anyone left in this house who could even play it. Or if it's just gathering dust because there's no music left in this family. Perhaps one of your help could manage a tune. Would settle the rumor that this house has gone silent for good." It was meant as an insult, a small cruelty dressed as a joke. Naomi watched Jae-ho's jaw tighten, watched the room wait to see how the insult would be answered. But Jaeho's eyes moved instead, slow and deliberate, across the row of staff standing near the wall, and stopped on Naomi. She felt it before she understood it, the particular weight of being looked at by someone who rarely bothered to look. She thought of the day she'd stood outside the carved doors of the music room, his voice behind her saying not that room, and she wondered, absurdly, if he'd noticed something in the way her hand had lingered on the wood. "Fine," Jaeho said, still looking at her. "Let's settle it." The room turned to follow his gaze, and Naomi felt 200 eyes land on her at once. "Sir," Sungmin said quietly, a warning wrapped in a single word, but Jaeho didn't look away from her. "You," he said. "Do you play?" It was not a question so much as a challenge. He wasn't asking because he believed she could. He was asking because it would embarrass Beck either way, whether she failed or refused. He expected her to say no. She should have said no. It would have been easier. It would have kept her invisible, which was the safest thing to be in a house like this. She felt Grace's eyes on her from across the room, felt Marcus straighten near the terrace doors, felt the whole weight of a life spent making herself small enough not to be noticed pressing down on the moment. But there was a violin in that locked room, 10 years untouched, and there was a woman across the room who had once played Vienna's stages before grief and money had taken it all away, and something in her refused to say no. "Yes," Naomi said. "I play." Beck laughed once, low and delighted, clearly expecting a disaster he could savor for months. "Then prove it," Jaeho said. His voice had gone very quiet. "The violin is upstairs." "The one in the music room," Naomi said. Not a question. "The one in the music room," he confirmed, and something passed behind his eyes, something like a dare aimed as much at himself as at her. "Bring it down," Jaeho said to Sungmin. "Now." The next several minutes passed in a strange, suspended quality of time, the kind Naomi remembered from before a performance. Sungmin returned carrying a case of dark, aged wood and set it on a side table with the care of a man handling something explosive. The room watched him open it. The violin's varnish glowed deep amber under the chandelier light, strings still intact, kept in tune by someone's quiet insistence over 10 long years even if no hand had touched it since the last one that mattered. Naomi set down her tray. She walked forward through a parting crowd, aware most of all of Jaeho, standing very still near the piano, watching her the way a man watches a door he isn't sure he wants opened. She lifted the violin from its case. It settled against her shoulder like it remembered the shape of a hand. She drew the bow once across the strings, adjusting, and the note that came out silenced the last of the murmuring in the room. "What will you play?" Jaeho asked. It wasn't really a question. It was almost a warning. Naomi looked at him, at the 10 years of careful stillness in his face, and made a choice that she understood, even as she made it, might undo something in him he had spent a decade holding together. "Grace told me your mother used to play here," Naomi said quietly, just for him, though the room strained to hear it. "She told me there was a piece your mother never finished. I don't know it, but I know how to find an ending for a piece I've never heard the start of. If you'll let me try." Something moved through Jaeho's face that Naomi would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Sungmin looked at his employer like he was bracing for an explosion the whole room would remember. "There's sheet music," Jaeho said finally, his voice rougher than before. "In the room. Unfinished. She was working on something the week she died." He stopped, like the sentence had cost him something to say aloud in front of strangers. "No one's touched it since." "Let me see it," Naomi said. He hesitated, then nodded once to Sungmin, who disappeared and returned minutes later with a few yellowed pages, handwritten notation in careful, elegant strokes gone slightly soft at the edges from a decade of being left alone in the dark. Naomi studied the pages while the room waited, feeling the weight of everyone's attention like heat against her skin. The composition was unfinished, the melody breaking off mid-phrase 2/3 of the way down the second page. It was in a minor key, aching and specific, a melody that spoke of longing without ever quite naming what was longed for. She lifted the violin again. She played the written portion first, note for careful note, feeling the room's silence deepen with every measure, feeling something in Jaeho's stillness change into something closer to pain. When she reached the place where the composition broke off, where his mother's hand had stopped moving across the page for the last time, Naomi did not stop. She kept playing. She built from the melody's own bones, extending its ache into resolution, letting the minor key breathe into something that wasn't quite happiness, but wasn't grief either, something that sounded like acceptance. She did not know this woman she was finishing a song for. She only knew the shape of loss, because she carried her own, and she let that shared shape guide the bow across the strings until the melody found its way to an ending that felt earned rather than arbitrary. When the last note faded, the ballroom was utterly silent. Naomi lowered the violin, her arms trembling slightly, and looked up to find Jaeho standing exactly where he'd been standing, except his face had lost every trace of its usual careful control. His eyes were wet, though he hadn't let a single tear fall. Beck, to his credit, said nothing more. Where? Jaeho said, his voice low and unsteady in a way Naomi had never heard from him. Did you learn to play like that? Before this house, Naomi said simply. Before a lot of things. He crossed the room to her, slow, deliberate, but there was nothing calculated in it now. That piece, he said. My mother worked on it for 2 years. She never finished it. I always thought it was supposed to stay unfinished. That finishing it would mean actually letting her be gone. Maybe it needed someone who didn't know her to finish it, Naomi said. Someone who could hear what was there instead of what was missing. He studied her for a long moment, and the room around them, sensing the conversation had moved somewhere private, resumed its low murmur of conversation. I doubted you, Jaeho admitted quietly. When I asked, I thought you'd say no, and it would end there. I know, Naomi said. You weren't wrong to doubt. You didn't know. No, he agreed. I didn't know a lot of things, it seems. Sungmin, standing a respectful distance away, cleared his throat once. Grace, near the wall, had a hand pressed over her mouth, and several of the other staff members were watching Naomi like they were seeing her for the first time, which, in a way, they were. Jaeho took the violin from her hands with a gentleness that surprised her, turning it over once, studying it like he was seeing it new. This has been sitting in that room for 10 years, he said. I couldn't look at it without seeing everything I lost, so I just stopped looking. You kept it in tune, Naomi said. Someone came in and kept the strings maintained. That's not nothing. I paid someone to do that, he said. I never came in myself. Not once. Not until tonight. You walked into a room I've avoided for a decade, and you didn't just play in it. You finished something I thought could never be finished. It's a good composition, Naomi said and meant it. She had real talent. She would have liked you, Jaeho said quietly, and it landed with more weight than anything he'd said all evening. She didn't like many people. She would have liked you. Naomi didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence between them stretched comfortable instead of strained. Grace found her a few minutes later near the drinks table, pressing a glass of water into her hand before she'd even asked for one. I have worked in this house 11 years, Grace said quietly, watching Jaeho retreat towards Sungmin across the room. I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he just looked at you. She said it without judgment. Be careful, she added, though it wasn't clear whether the warning was meant to protect Naomi or the fragile thing that had just cracked open in Jaeho's carefully guarded composure. I don't know what just happened, Naomi admitted. Neither does he, Grace said. That's usually how it starts. The rest of the party unwound slowly around them, guests drifting back into conversation, the orchestra hired for the evening resuming a quieter set. Naomi returned to her duties out of habit more than obligation, though she noticed Jaeho's gaze finding her more than once across the room, brief and unreadable, but no longer indifferent. Beck left an hour later without the swagger he'd arrived with, offering Jaeho a stiff nod at the door that Jaeho did not bother returning. Later, after the party had mostly emptied, after the staff had cleared the last of the champagne glasses and the house had settled back into its usual careful quiet, Jaeho found Naomi in the kitchen, still in her uniform, drying a stack of dishes because old habits from a working life did not disappear just because a room had gone strange and unexpected around her. You should not be doing dishes, he said from the doorway. Someone has to. Not you. Not tonight. He stepped into the kitchen, looking oddly out of place among the steel counters and hanging pots. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not the way staff are trained to answer their employer. Naomi set down the dish towel. Okay. Why did you say yes tonight? You could have said no. No one would have blamed you. It would have been easier. She considered the question honestly before answering. Because I spent a year telling myself the music was over, she said. That it was something I used to be instead of something I was. And when you asked, I realized I was tired of that story. I didn't do it for you. I did it because I needed to know if it was still there. Was it? Yes, she said. It was still there. Something in his face settled, like a question he hadn't known he was asking had finally been answered. I would like, he said carefully, for you to have access to that room. Not as staff completing a task. As someone who understands what's in it. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. He held her gaze, steady in a way that made the kitchen feel smaller than it was. I want to. There's a difference, and I think you, of all people, understand it. Naomi thought of the unfinished composition, of the 10 years he'd spent unable to walk into a room that held his mother's last unresolved thought, of the strange, careful gift he was offering her now. I'd like that, she said. He nodded once, the gesture of a man closing a negotiation, except there had been nothing transactional in it at all. There are other pieces, he said. In that room. Things she started and never finished. I never had the courage to look through all of them. We could look together, Naomi offered. If you wanted. He considered this for a long moment, and something almost like relief moved through his expression. The relief of a man who had been carrying something heavy alone for far too long, and had just been offered, without asking for it, a second pair of hands. The next morning, Naomi found Marcus already on the back porch, a second cup of coffee waiting beside her usual one, though he said nothing about the party as she sat down across from him. He never asked about things directly. It was one of the things she liked most about him. Heard you played something last night, he finally said, eyes on the garden rather than on her. I did. Heard it was good. It was honest, she said, which felt closer to the truth than good ever could. I hadn't touched a violin in almost a year. I didn't know if my hands would remember. Marcus nodded slowly, turning his mug in his hands. Hands remember more than we give them credit for. My father used to say the body keeps things the mind tries to bury. He glanced at her sideways. You planning on picking it back up? For real, I mean. Not just for one strange night in a ballroom. Naomi considered the question longer than she expected to. I don't know yet, she admitted. It's complicated. Most good things are, Marcus said, and left it there, which was exactly what she needed him to do. She thought about his question for the rest of the day, turning it over the way she used to turn over difficult passages of music, looking for the place where the phrase resolved. She had spent a year telling herself that walking away from music had been a practical choice, a necessary casualty of circumstance, nothing more. But sitting on that porch with Marcus, feeling the ordinary warmth of the coffee cup between her hands, she recognized something closer to the truth. She had been afraid. Not of failing, exactly, but of remembering how much she had loved something that the world had made impossible to keep. That evening, back at the small apartment she still kept in the city for her one day off a week, she found herself standing in front of her closet for a long time before finally opening it. The violin case sat exactly where she'd left it. Dust settled faintly along its edges. She didn't take it out. She only looked at it, acknowledging its presence the way she might acknowledge an old friend she wasn't quite ready to call, but no longer wanted to pretend didn't exist. Sungmin came to see Naomi separately, a few days after the party, finding her in the laundry room folding linens with the same care she brought to everything. He stood in the doorway a moment before speaking, uncharacteristically hesitant for a man usually so precise in his movements. Beck will not let this go quietly, he said without preamble. A man like that does not enjoy being humbled in front of his peers. He will look for a way to even the account. Naomi set down the linen in her hands. What does that mean exactly? It means Mr. Min will need to be careful for a while. And so will you, by association, whether either of you wants that or not. Sungmin's expression did not soften, but something in his tone did. I have worked for this family a long time. I have never seen him drop his guard the way he did in that ballroom. I don't know what to make of it yet. But I wanted you to understand what it might cost before it goes any further than it already has. Are you warning me away from him? I am telling you the truth, Sungmin said. What you do with it is your business. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I don't think it's a mistake. I think it might be the first honest thing that's happened in this house in a very long time. I only want you to walk into it with your eyes open, not closed. Naomi thought about his words for the rest of the afternoon, turning them over the way she'd once turned over difficult passages of music. She had not asked for any of this. Not the job, not the challenge in the ballroom, not whatever strange, unfinished thing had begun to take shape between herself and a man she still barely understood. But she had also stopped pretending, somewhere in the last week, that she wanted to walk away from it simply because it might come with a cost. Some things were worth the risk of being complicated. She was beginning to suspect this might be one of them. That night, unable to sleep, Naomi finally drove back to her apartment during her half-day off and took the violin case down from the closet shelf for the first time in nearly a year. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long while before opening it, running her fingers along the worn latches the way she used to before every performance, a small ritual she hadn't realized she'd missed until her hands remembered it on their own. She did not play that night. She only held the instrument, feeling its familiar weight settle against her, reacquainting herself with something she had convinced herself was gone for good. When she finally set it back in its case, she left the case open on her dresser instead of returning it to the closet, a small, deliberate choice that felt larger than it should have. The following week, on a quiet Sunday when the house had emptied of guests and business, and the particular tension that seemed to follow Jae-ho through every weekday, he led her to the carved doors for the first time as something other than a trespasser. The room inside was smaller than she'd imagined, warmer, lined with shelves of sheet music organized by a hand that had clearly loved order, a single chair positioned near the window where light would have fallen across a music stand each morning. Jae-ho stood in the doorway a long moment before stepping fully inside, as though the threshold itself required a kind of permission he was only now willing to grant himself. They spent the afternoon going through the shelves together, unearthing 3 more unfinished compositions, each one interrupted at a different point, each one a small window into a woman neither of them could ask directly about the reasons behind the silence. Naomi played fragments of each, and Jae-ho listened with an attention she suspected he rarely gave anything, his questions growing less guarded as the hours passed, until by evening he was telling her small, ordinary things about his mother, the way she'd hummed while cooking, the way she'd insisted on real flowers in the house even during years when money was tight. Details that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with a person Naomi was only now beginning to understand had been more than a shrine behind locked doors. At one point, sorting through a stack of pages near the bottom shelf, Jae-ho went quiet in a way that made Naomi look up from the composition in her lap. He was holding a photograph, small, slightly faded, tucked between 2 sheets of music like a bookmark someone had forgotten to remove. He didn't show it to her right away. "My mother," he said finally, turning it so Naomi could see. A woman with a warm, direct gaze stood beside a much younger Jae-ho, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, the kind of unguarded joy that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the careful, controlled man standing in front of her now. This was taken the year before she got sick. I haven't looked at a photograph of her in longer than I want to admit. "She has your eyes," Naomi said. "Everyone says that." He studied the photograph a moment longer before setting it carefully on the windowsill, propped up where the afternoon light could reach it, an act so small and so deliberate that Naomi understood exactly what it cost him. "I used to think keeping this room sealed was the only way I knew how to protect what was left of her. Like opening it would let all of it get out and disappear. And now I think maybe it was never about protecting her," he said slowly, working the thought out as he spoke it. "Maybe it was about not having to feel the specific kind of pain that comes with actually finishing something. As long as it stayed unfinished, Some part of me got to pretend she wasn't really gone. There was still a page left to turn. Naomi didn't offer him easy comfort, because she understood, from her own year of careful avoidance, that comfort offered too quickly rarely landed the way it was meant to. Instead, she simply sat with him in the quiet, the two of them surrounded by a decade of silence that no longer felt quite as heavy as it once had, and let the moment be exactly as complicated as it needed to be. "I would like that," he said finally, echoing her own words back to her, and for the first time since Naomi had started working in that house, the silence between them felt like something built rather than something guarded. The party guests would talk for weeks about the maid who had silenced Director Beck without raising her voice, about the son who had finally walked back into a room he'd sealed off for a decade, about the fact that Min Jae-ho, a man famous for revealing nothing, had stood in his own ballroom with his composure cracked wide open for anyone to see. But none of them would ever fully understand what had actually happened that night, that a woman who had once given up on her own music had been asked, quite by accident, to help someone else find the ending to theirs, and that in doing so, she had found her own beginning again, in a house full of careful silences that had, for one evening, learned how to make music instead.